Hello, class. Welcome back to History 1301. Get something here. Yeah, there you go. Today we're doing Chapter 10, Democracy in America. Pretty, pretty triumphal title there. 1815 to 1840. Still more or less in the same time period we've been talking about the last couple of chapters, Chapter 9 and Chapter 8, indeed. But today we're focusing on the politics of this era. And it mostly surrounds this one guy, Andrew Jackson. Indeed, this time period is called has it's a namesake of his, the Age of Jackson. It's called often. It's also known as the Age of the Common Man, and it's called. I guess the reason why Dr. Fonner here, Eric Fonner, uses democracy in America. It's really the time period when democracy begins to flourish. Uh, Truly, right? Democracy, and this means as the people begin to have a say in politics, in national politics, local politics, namely because property rights qualifications are rid of during this time period, 1824 more or less. Property qualifications are rid of. People are able to vote, whether you have land or not. So now it's seen like a democracy. Now the common man, the non-freeholders, people that have no land, are able to vote now. So democracy is seen as flourishing. So we have this Jacksonian democracy, so it's called as well. Uh, is oftentimes Jackson is a very ambivalent character. You can either love him or hate him, more or less. Um, he did come from like an impoverished background. He was orphaned during the Eighth Revolution. His dad died before he was born. All his brothers and mom died by the age of 14. By the age of 14, he was an orphan. He was there from the Carolinas, from the border, from the borders of the Carolinas. Uh, but he made himself he's like the self-made man. He made himself rich. He went from rags to riches, per se. He became a very powerful, wealthy plantation owner in Tennessee and a powerful politician, senator, and representative from Tennessee. Which we know Andrew Jackson, he's on a $20 bill. He's going to become a president as well. So Andrew Jackson kind of embodies, incorporates, right, this the ideals that were being more or less processed during this time period, 1815 to 1840. So you see the Market Revolution, which was the last chapter. You see the Westward movement, not just of settlers with squatters, so to say last time, but also now the Westward movement of Indians and slavery, the expansion of slavery, the growth of democracy. Uh, the self-made man is kind of like the main concept of this, I guess, chapter more or less. But this is the self-made man available for white men, not for example, for women, for African Americans, for Native Americans, the other kind of people, and this polity, they actually lose democracy, tremendously lose democracy. Uh, but white settlers, Euro Americans, they gain a lot of rights. So it's this gaining, and it's kind of like not a zero sum game, but it's this balance between some people gain rights and they at the back of they lose rights. So that's what's going on here. Political democracy, triumph of the political democracy. There's no more property qualifications. You don't have to pay to vote no more, so everybody's able to vote now. So Andrew Jackson, as a matter of fact, is the only president that claimed that he was voted in by the popular vote, not really by the electoral. We'll talk about that more later. So let's talk about what the book has here. By 1860, basically, all but one state had ended property rights qualifications. Uh, some, however, continue to bar to now allow some persons if they accepted poor relief, if they accepted aid from the state, because if you were poor, it meant that you were not capable of choosing for yourself. You were dependent. You were just, if you were poor, it was seen like something more genetic, right? You were just naturally inferior. Thus, you should not be able to vote because that's irresponsible. This is the same scientific justification that was given to racism, that African Americans are now uh, just genetically inferior. Thus, we should take away their vote for them. So by 1860, property qualifications, requirements for voting were taken away. By 1860, all black men, even free black men, could not vote. So this take away, give and take, it's happening here. So now personal independence, as before, as its Jeffersonian vision was about the yeoman, then you have a piece of land, and this is the epitome of liberty and independence for Americans. This is the old Jeffersonian vision here. Now we're trying to see a shift of this vision of America from not the yeoman having the land, but of ownership of land, but ownership of oneself. Right? The ownership of oneself is a reflection of this growing individualism. But it's a harbinger of the Enlightenment period. It's also happening around the world, primarily in Western Europe. So not the ownership of property now is the litmus test of liberty, but the ownership of oneself. This, I would briefly talk about the Door War. The Door War is basically Rhode Island was the exception here. Rhode Island didn't give up the property qualifications. It was run by landed elites. And then Thomas Dorr led an uprising, pretty much, or was about to lead an uprising, and he was going to become the governor of Rhode Island and undo all these property qualifications and stuff. President John Tyler stepped in and pretty much squashed that insurrection before it even started. So that's basically what's going on, is that people are thinking that they deserve the common man, all the common man. And here it should be read as common white man, and men, or women, or no blacks, or no Native Americans. The common white man should be allowed to vote, should be allowed to be part of the politics of the nation or the state. It should not be part of the exclusive society elites. And this is what the original framers of the U.S. Constitution wanted politics to be, out of the hands of the commoners. Because if you put the politics in the hands of the commoners, it creates chaos, right? So now we're seeing a big shift in what democracy is. Right? Now democracy is for everybody, for the common man, not just for the landed elite that has, right? Who was it? Alexander Hamilton, right? What did he say? He said something about, only the people who are worthy, the people who are wealthy, the people who are smart and educated should be allowed to vote. Right? The wealthy ones, basically, the aristocrats. Now we're seeing a backlash against that vision. An example of this is this guy, Alexis de Tocqueville. It's a French guy. This French guy in the 1830s, he goes to America. He's from France. France is also going through turmoil and trying to figure itself out, whether it's a republic, monarchy, democracy, what's going on. Right? So they took he's like a sociologist, anthropologist. So he goes and studies. He goes there to study prisons in America, the prison system in America, penitentiaries. But then he just gets involved, or he gets sidetracked by the notion of democracy in America. And that's the name of the book he eventually writes, Democracy in America. It's a 2-volume book. He publishes it in 1833, the first volume. But the key insight that he talks about is that democracy by this time is not just the right to vote or a particular set of rights or a particular set of political institutions to enact these rights, this right to vote, but it's more, as he said, a habit of the heart. It's passionate. Right? There's a whole culture, society. It's a cultural apparatus now. Democracy. It's not just political. Right? It's part of the fabric of American society now. It's part of the heart of society. It's not politics or political institutions, right? Voting and right the House of Legislature and House whatever. It's not just that now. Right? Democracy now is in everyday life. Now it's in the heart of American culture. And this was all about, this belief in equality and this democracy for the common, right? And again, read as common white men. Uh, so democracy had become this essential attribute of America. This American freedom is democracy. And this was a big departure from the standard of Western thought. This idea that sovereignty belongs to the masses, that the power belongs to the masses, to the ordinary citizens. This was a new departure. This was a pretty radical idea for Western Europeans and for us Americans. For example, Aristotle, Plato, there are a lot of these political philosophers, Thomas Hobbes, for example, right, the Leviathan, right, they all justified and they all warned that democracy was a bad thing, that democracy was terrible. For example, Plato hated democracy because it killed Socrates, right? A democracy wanted to kill Socrates, who was perhaps the greatest, the wisest man alive, supposedly. Right? Thomas Hobbes, not for the same reasons, but because it creates chaos. Right? If we don't have a strong political government or a strong monarchy to control us, then we go into chaos, which is a state of nature for Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan. We need a Leviathan to control us. Right? So all these political philosophers, until this time period, 1815, 1820s, 1830s, were about we need a strong political body to control the masses. The power should be on the government, not on the masses. Now it's on the masses. Now it's flipped. Power, sovereignty, political sovereignty. Now it's flipped. Now it's on the masses. Power should lay on the masses. This is more the Lockean, John Locke vision of political philosophy. All right. So the age of Jackson, right? This democracy, pretty much, for white males, triumphed during this Jacksonian, right, the so-called Jacksonian democracy. So the right to vote became equated with American citizenship. So African Americans, right, increasingly became non-citizens. Native Americans as well, right, and women. Right? They were just like wards or subjects of America. So this public sphere, now we create this public sphere, right? Now we create this public sphere where debates are happening, political debates and ideas are being floated around. We have the invention of the penny press, which is called the penny press because it costs 1 penny to buy these newspapers and pamphlets. So we have this big spread of presses and pamphlets and articles and stuff in newspapers. And people were getting information. People were being fed information. Right? So it was a lively democracy if we were able to vote, to participate in this. Right? If you were a white male, you were able to participate into this lively democracy, right? This public sphere that was being created. Right? And you also had the so-called alternative newspapers, right? These radical newspapers. We even had a black newspaper. The first ever was the Freedom's Journal, the first black newspaper. It was suppressed after a while, but we had that in the 1830s, 1820s. We had the Philadelphia Mechanics Advocate, which is one of the first labor publications, which is like labor rights. The Liberator, the Cherokee Phoenix was the first Native American newspaper. So we have this burgeoning of presses, of the free press. Okay, so the public sphere, right? This information revolution as well. Not just a market revolution, but an information revolution as well. People are being more informed. That's the first thing you got to do to be able to vote, right? Be informed, right? If you go into a polling place and you have no idea what the politicians are standing for, then your vote is useless, right? Or dangerous even, right? Because you don't know who you're voting for. So you always got to be informed, right? And this was what the framers of the Constitution were saying. If you're poor and you have no education, how can you be informed and vote? Right? Don't leave it to the masses. It's got to be for the informed elite to vote because they know better, right? But now it's like, no, it's the masses. We know best, right? Everybody knows best, which is cool, but it also could be dangerous. Right? Democracy could be dangerous, right? Again, we are going to Plato and the Republic of Plato. write that. That's a really important book. It's not just for history, but for life. So Plato, perhaps the most important philosopher in Western history, Western European history, Plato's The Republic. He says that straight up, democracy is dangerous, absolutely dangerous. It's mob rule, right? It's just whatever the mob rules, right? Now, for him, it's about political. It's about philosophers, right? People that are smart should be the ones that are being control and power, because they'll be responsible. He has a whole system of why and stuff, which I won't get into. But now we're seeing that flip side. Now we're seeing sovereignty belongs with the population, popular sovereignty, the masses, the white masses. Um, we still see some pockets of women writers, especially with the free press. We see, for example, Catherine Beecher becomes a writer there, Maria Sedgwick, Lydia Maria Child. We see this small new generation of women writers as well doing this that were able to make a modest living with their publications. But yeah, in 1807 though, New Jersey was one of the first states to add the word male in the constitutions, and that from 1807, from the new New Jersey Constitution, kind of led to like a trend of excluding women. Now we only have male to vote, male citizens. Right? There's no females now. No, it's exclusive. So right again, this process of giving and taking is happening here. It is so again, giving and taking away the right to franchise. So the franchise just means the right to vote. You become disenfranchised. So people, the groups of people become disenfranchised during this time period. African Americans, and just because of for the same reasons, there's a common denominator that justifies why we should take the right to vote away from these people. African Americans, whether you're a slave or a freedman, doesn't matter. Women, whether doesn't matter what color you are, and then Native Americans, Indians, these three groups, they become disenfranchised during this rise in democracy, right? Which is kind of ironic, right, or contradictory. Um, and they all take away the rights to vote. They become disenfranchised because of this scientific, we call it kind of scientific racism or scientific sexism. We call it. So we see the rise of this like scientists that are using Darwin, basically Charles Darwin, social Darwinism, uh, to promote the idea that certain groups of people that are genetically predisposed to lack some abilities, to lack some skills. They're predisposed to lack the, the, the the willpower to self control themselves. Like African Americans, uh, they're hypersexual. They have no lack. They lack control of that. Right? So we gotta control them somehow. Right? Women, they gotta be dependent on the man. Right? They're frail, whatever. Right? Native Americans, they're savages. They're barbarians. We gotta control them. Right? So there's kind of like there's like some limitations that they have inherently. Supposedly, these people have inherent genetic limitations, and that's why the reason. So it's kind of like this science becomes more, and it's like a pseudoscience now. And I really don't want to call it pseudoscience. Now we call it pseudoscience, or some people call it pseudoscience, because it's not really scientific. I run out of space. But for example, I'm talking about necrology, no, not necrology, phrenology. Listening to too much goth metal music. Phrenology, which is a study of the cranium of your head. So people think that we had certain head shapes give rise to certain like brain matter, and like the more brain matter you had, the more smart. I don't know what it's. The size of your head, the physical features of you, determine how smart or dumb you were. It's phrenology. You also had the rise of eugenics. right? Early eugenics, right? It's your genes that determine whether you're fit or not fit, right? And this is what the 1920s, later on, like 50, 60, no, basically in 100 years from this time period, it becomes like a really, really important scientific endeavor in the U.S. And then Hitler takes it to its maximum. So we have this rise, this early rise of the scientist racism. Now we're saying that, for example, Native Americans back then, with Jefferson, for example, we thought that they were like a little bit lower in the civilization scale. They could be helped if they get civilized, if they adopt, right, our way of life, then they'll become equal to us. But right now they're not. They're wards. We gotta take care of them first, and then teach them how to become citizens, how to become fit for citizens. Now we're increasingly with science, supposedly, there's no way for that. Now they're just naturally. There's no way. They're just that's the way they're born. And that's the reason why we gotta take away the right to vote. So we see this rise of this scientist racism, right? And not just in America, right? This comes from Western Europe. Right? This is all over the where European empires are now using that as a justification to conquest people, basically. So now it's not class that determines whether you could vote or not. So before this 1820s, 1840s, this time period here that we're talking about, if you were a black man and you were freed, right, and you had money to pay to vote, and you had land, right, you were equal, right? Basically, politically equal. Now, that doesn't matter. Even if you have money, even if you have land, you just can't vote now. Now, race becomes the main delimiting line between voting or not voting, between citizen or non-citizenship. Right? So race had replaced class as a boundary between those American men who were entitled to enjoy this political freedom and those who were not. So this is pretty important stuff here. What's going on? All right, let's talk about what do I have here? So I guess national republicans, nationalism, and discontents, as Dr. Funner calls it. All right, so we talk about in this section of the chapter, the main concept we got to learn is the American system, the so-called. And this is different from the American system of manufacturing that we talked about earlier in the chapter, prior chapter. The American system of manufacturing was about about productivity, about producing stuff in the factories, about producing basically. This is Eli Whitney. People produce one part of an entire mechanism. So, for example, guns. Eli Whitney, who created the cotton gin, who revolutionized the cotton industry. He also made guns, but he would mass produce just parts in parts. So he would mass produce one part, another part, and another part. Mass produce each part, and they were interchangeable, right? So so it was so if you were out in the field and your gun gave out, you could go easily to go to a shop and get that part you needed. Right? And this is the way it works now. Right? This is the way we have now. Right? Even cars are like that. There's certain parts. You go to AutoZone or whatever, and you go and get your part that you need. Right? It's interchangeable. It's kind of like that one model, 1 year, one car make, and that part is for it fits every single one of those things. Right? That's the system of American system of manufacturing. Now, though, we're talking about the American system that's politics, the political American system. Right? And this is a nationalist. This is the rise of nationalism. This is really the spearheaded by nationalist Republicans. They call themselves a nationalist Republicans. So remember, this is now the era of good feelings, so-called era of good feelings. The Federalist Party now is gone. The Hartford Convention was their death knell. Now they're dead, basically, the Federalist Party. So now we have the Republicans. Right? But now we have a spectrum between the Republicans. We have the nationalists and the Democratic Republicans. right? So the big difference between the nationalist Republicans and the Democratic Republicans is that the nationalists, they want a stronger national government, a more active national government. They want a government that could give, and this is the American system, right? One, uh, they want a national government that's stronger, that has a new national bank. So remember that during the War of 1812, we had the first national bank in the U.S. We got rid of it. It was terrible for us. It was, it created a panic. And now these nationalist Republicans, and these are people like Henry Clay of Kentucky, John Calhoun of South Carolina, and Daniel Webster and John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts. And all these people were championing a stronger and more active national government, away from state rights and more to a more centralized national government. These are these people, the nationalist Republicans. And so they wanted to promote this American system, this political American system. The first thing, it was a three-part thing. The first thing was a new national bank. The second part of this program was a tariff on important manufactured goods, so a tax on importations, uh, particularly on like iron, hemp, textiles. So stuff that Northerners, people in New England, manufacturing centers in New England, right, in Pawtucket, in Lowell, Massachusetts, in Pawtucket, New Jersey, all these manufacturing cities that we talked about in the earlier chapters, right? They were manufacturing iron, right? They were using textiles, right, made out of hemp or cotton or whatever, right? There were these items, these commodities, right? If you were importing, say, iron or a hemp-made shirt from London or from England, right? Which they were getting from India, right? This global empire network. They would charge you a tax, right? It would be more expensive. It's an import. It's a tariff, right? So that you could be kind of incentivized, right? You'd be suggested, or you'd be kind of forced, if you didn't have enough money to pay that tax, that tariff, to buy American-made products. Right? This is what we call a protective tariff. Right? It's just a tax on importing goods, so you buy domestic goods. Right? So we'll put a tax on a BMW, so you won't buy, so you have to buy a Chevy. Kind of the same idea here. Right? This is economic stuff. Right? So this is the second part of the American system: a tariff on manufactured goods that you can get here domestically. And this is basically protected New England manufacturing centers. Southerners saw this as an affront to them, right? Because they were used to getting cheap stuff, inexpensive stuff imported from England, right? They had connections from England directly. They have cotton, they need cotton. I need, you manufactured goods, furniture, I don't know, farming equipment as well, right? So they had their own, deal with England, and this seemed like intervening with the state rights here of the South, right? So this tariff was seen as this abomination towards the South. And then the third part of this American system that these nationalist Republicans were pushing forward, so again, Henry Clay, John Calhoun, Daniel Webster, John Quincy Adams, was the third part was federal investment, federal financing of national roads and national canals. Right? Just improved canals and roads that should be paid by the national government. The whole national states should embark on the debt. So only two of these programs passed Congress. The most controversial one apparently was the one about national roads. Even into President Andrew Jackson's presidency, this was very controversial. That this was a state's initiative, that the national government should not invest or get in debt in creating national roads or national canals and stuff. But the tariff was passed in 1816. Also in 1816, a new bank of the U.S. was created, and Congress gave it a 20-year charter. Right, so in 20 years, it was going to be This is going to be up for Congress to see if it's going to continue or if it's going to be done away with. So the monster bank, that's what people called it, the second bank of the U.S., the monster bank. Um, Quickly, it became like the focus of public resentment. It became just the thorn John Quincy's presidency. It was so basically what happened here with the second bank of the U.S. It's in charge of issuing paper money, right, collecting taxes. It's a financial agent for the national government. It's 80% privately owned, 20% is owned by the government. And most of the investors are just really rich people from New York, right? The Astor family, John Astor stuff, the one who financed the War of 1812, basically, because of the absence of the Bank of the U.S. So now it's more formal. Now there's the Bank of the U.S. There's a little bit of oversight, right? But these people are out there to make a bank, to make a profit on this bank. And there's John Astor, I forget what other family from New York, also heavily invested. Right, so 80% privately owned, right? It's a corporation, right? It's just shareholders, and then 20% is owned by the national government itself, right? So it's in charge of issuing paper money, legal tender, collecting taxes, and paying the government's debt. Whatever the government owes, whether it's England or whether it's France, they're in charge of paying that back, or whether it's private individuals. And later on, Astor, right? You have to pay them back. And the whole point was it's like to lend money easily, right? To give more loans to farmers and to protect the domestic economy. But it became really easy to just sort of pump out a lot of print money, to print a lot of money. It became really easy to do that, really, really tempting to do that, and they did it. And this gave rise to inflation of prices of just commodities, right? Milk became more expensive, eggs became more expensive, just everything became more expensive because there was just a lot more money in more money supply in the whole economy. So just more money in the economy, more printed money in the economy, more legal tender, prices will go up, right? So created this whole mess basically. People resented that, right? So it became seen as the monster bank, and people equated it with having special privileges to like this rich wealthy man. There were shareholders behind it. Uh, so it just basically broke confidence in banking, in these printed money, right? If you were not sure if you had like a printed money from the bank, it was worth anything or not? Is it backed up by actual silver and gold, or was it just printed because they could just print money now? So there was a problem there, right? Corruption basically was going on here, right? The overissuance of printing, of print money, of paper money. So this gives rise to the Panic of 1819, right? So there's a lot of reasons why this happened. So this is that one of the main reasons is that which is printing a lot of money, right? It seemed easy. The reason why we printed a lot of money is because the cotton industry is doing well, is booming. Cotton prices are really way up. And this is because of the effect of the War of 1812. It's hard to get cotton, but people still need cotton. So prices are really high up for cotton. So now the War of 1812 is done. Cotton prices go back to the regular, normal standard that they were before the war. So now all this overproduction that we're doing to create cotton, right? It creates this bubble just burst, basically. So now all the loans that the farmers were getting, ask the state banks in this national bank, the second U.S. bank, farmers would get loaned to produce more cotton because cotton was booming, right? The price of cotton was high, so if you produce more, you make more money. It makes logical sense, right? But now the price dropped tremendously, back to its normal levels. So now you're over here overproducing cotton, and the banks know this, right? So now the bank is reclaiming, wants to, call in your loan you could be paid for, but you have no money because your cotton is not profitable no more. So you can't repay your loan. So these smaller banks can repay the loans to the bigger banks, and it creates this whole chain of events, this big bubble that bursts. Um, And it results in the Panic of 1819, the so-called Panic of 1819. Um, and it really affects politics, really, right? It really gives a bad taint to politicians, right? It kind of gives this idea of like these nationalists, right? Look at the power of the U.S. They gave it a bad name, right? Now it became a monster bank, right? Not the U.S. bank, not the Bank of the U.S., not the Bank of the United States, and now it's just like this monster bank, this symbol of corruption, right? This epitome of political corruption. Uh, an example of this discontent is McCulloch versus Maryland, this U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1819, right smack in the middle. So the the National Bank of the U.S. is reclaiming taxes from the states, right? They're in a panic, they're broke, they need money, and Maryland is like, nah, screw you, we're not going to give you our taxes, like that. It's our taxes, we're going to keep them. So McCulloch is the works for the U.S. Treasury. I think he's the Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, and he personally sues Maryland. So you have to give us the money, right? We're the national government, and this is one of the landmark decisions, right? The John Marshall Supreme Court. John Marshall is the Chief Justice here, and this is one of the Supreme Court decisions that establishes, right, the superiority of federalism, that the federal government trumps state governments, that the federal government is stronger, right, has more jurisdiction, has more sovereignty than state governments. Right? McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819. The power to tax, this is John Marshall, involves the power to destroy. So if the federal government cannot collect taxes on the states, then you can destroy the federal government. And that's pretty much treason. Right? So the states lack the authority to destroy an agency such as the Treasury Department or the federal government. Okay, so this is the McCulloch versus Maryland decision, reinforcing the power, the sovereignty of the federal national government. So he's a nationalist, right? He's a federalist actually, and now that same banner of extending national power is taking upon these nationalist Republicans. All right. Next important thing that's happening in this time period in 1816, then 1818, 1820s, is the Missouri Compromise. So this is again, we're in the era of good feelings. It's just one party now, but there's sectionalism now, right? There's different factions under that one party, the splintering. This one party, this Republican Party. So it was pretty much instead of competing two parties competing against each other, it was just one party but different interests, special interests within that party. That's how politics is now, in the era of good feelings. So Missouri in 1819, right after this panic kind of slows down, Missouri is this Western territory that's carved out of the Louisiana Purchase, and they want to apply for admission to become a state to the Union. Fuck yeah, most everybody's like, yeah, let's do it. We need you, right? However, the Constitution of Missouri provides that slavery is allowed. And this guy, James Talmadge from New York, this Republican congressman from New York, introduces this notion that slaves should be prohibited. Right? That slaves should not be, that we should stop the Western expansion of slavery. We thought slavery was going to die out, right, to begin with. But then the cotton industry revived it. And then now we're going to extend it to the Western states, to the Western territories. John Talmadge was like, no, we should stop slavery from expanding westwardly. So Talmadge made a proposal, and it just sparked tremendous fucking controversy. This whole debate, 2 years, right? The Missouri Compromise, right? Ended up in a compromise. It was basically like 2 years of intense debate back and forth. Firestorm basically erupted here. Um, so the Talmadge proposal about restricting slavery westward to these new westward territories and westward states that are popping up now was this: is that no more slaves to these western territories. Main thing. And the second thing is that the children of these slaves already in Missouri would be free at the age of 25. So it passed the House, not with controversy, but it passed the House of Representatives. Now it went to the Senate. Fuck no, the Senate just rejected it outright, basically because the South was controlling the Senate here. It just died. This proposal died in the Senate. In 1820, we have Senator Jesse Thomas from Illinois, who did this who reworked another compromise, this other deal, see if the southern states would allow it. And Maine wanted to become part of the state now, become part of the United States, a new state now. So this was the compromise. This is the Missouri Compromise. So Maine, up in the north, becomes a state, 1820, and it outlaws, prohibits slavery. Maine, right? So Maine prohibited slavery, is admitted to the Union, and then Missouri will be authorized to draft the Constitution without these restrictions that Talmadge had proposed to begin with. So this is so Missouri drafts their state constitution. It allows for for slavery, and then in that constitution, it prohibits free blacks from entering the state. So this first constitution, the Constitution of Missouri, it prohibits free blacks from entering the state. And this is in direct violation of the so-called comity clause of the U.S. Constitution. The comity clause stipulates that no other state could intervene with other states' laws. Right? It requires each state to recognize the rights of citizens of other states. So in Maine, this new state, you're a free black, and you have the right to vote. Right? You go to Missouri, you're supposed to be allowed to enter and you should be allowed to vote, I guess, as well. You should be recognized as a citizen as well, right? So the comity clause requires each state to recognize the rights of citizens of other states. But Missouri, with this constitution that it drafted, right, with this Missouri Compromise, it prohibited free blacks from entering the state. So there was again a whole controversy happening. So Missouri was like, okay, we'll prohibit. We'll get rid of that stipulation. We'll observe the comity clause. We're still gonna allow slavery, but we're gonna observe other people's rights from other states. Okay, that was cool, but that was totally ignored. Missouri was a terrible place if you were a black person. You could basically be enslaved if you're a free black person from it. And this is what happened. We'll see later on what happened there. We'll see this court case decision, Dred Scott, and that happens there. So that's the Missouri Compromise. It's basically what's going on here. So we're trying to keep a balance between slave states and free states. And then with Maine coming in, okay, so we keep that balance between, and this is the balance between representation in Congress, right? This is all based upon the states, right? Representation in Congress is based upon how many population, the number of population, people you have in each state. And then each state has one senator, right? So if you add one more state that allows slavery, it's going to tip the balance towards the South. So now we're going to keep the balance by adding Maine in Missouri. So Maine is a free state, Missouri is a slave state. And then we have, besides that, the Missouri Compromise also sets up this line, the 3630 line, Missouri's southern boundary. So anything north of the 3630 line, right? This is the latitude of the world map in the atlas. The 3630 line, anything north of that line, it's all going to be free states. We're going westward. Right? That line is going to be free states. Anything south of that line is going to be slave states as we go westward. The only exception is going to be Missouri. Right? Missouri actually lies above the 3630 line. And this is the Missouri Compromise to maintain that balance between slave states and free states. It's not going to last long, right? I hate to break it. Spoiler alert, right? This Missouri Compromise, this balance, it's not going to last long, right? By 1860, we're in war because of this fucking thing, because of slavery. The one who engineered the second compromise, right? This is the final one, I guess. Is Henry Clay, right? This guy from Kentucky, right? Very famous politicians back then, right? He was seen as like the representative of the West. He was a national Republican then. So this Missouri Compromise basically opens up Pandora's box, right? The question of the westward expansion of slavery now becomes a fucking question. Now becomes a really important debate in politics. Now we have the rise of abolitionist movements, and we have the rise of anti-abolitionist movements, right? It becomes this really important crux in U.S. politics and society. It becomes a really important dividing line for the Union. For example, John Quincy Adams, right? He pretty much predicted, right? This is going to be the dissolution of the Union, right? It's going to result in civil war, and it's going to result in civil war and the extirpation of slavery from this whole continent, from getting rid of slavery, right? But it's going to first end up in civil war and then the end of slavery. And in 40 years, that will come true. All right. Let's talk about world politics. Right? It's all about politics. Let's talk about what's going on in Spain. Right? Spain and Latin America. Right? So we have this other empire here to worry about still. Right? So we have Native Americans kind of still messing around. We have the Comanche Empire. And then we have the Spanish Empire, basically the same area. Then we have us going westward, the U.S. So we're still in this imperial framework here. So what's going on? So between 1810 and 1820, basically there's no more the Spanish Empire in Americas. So if we first begin, where's the first one? I think it was Argentina or Bolivia. Where is the Monroe Doctrine? Yeah, so Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, pretty much in the same year, by 1815, they begin revolting. For example, 1820, 1821, officially, 1821, Mexico gets their independence. It's a whole different deal. It's in 1820 they first do it, and then Maximilian, the Spanish king, becomes emperor again, Emperor Maximiliano. But 1821 it only lasts a year. They kill him, or he gets exiled, and it's very bloody and stuff. The independence of Mexico. It's fascinating. But by 1821, Mexicans, right, born there, right, mestizos now are the ones in power. So just this whole rebellions, movements in Spanish Latin America between 1810 and 1820. 1820 being Mexico, the last one to gain their independence from Spain. 1819, we have the Transcontinental Treaty. Spain cedes all of Florida to the U.S. And in return, the U.S. government pays Spain $5 million for Florida. And remember, they were already on Florida. Andrew Jackson had already occupied Florida because he was hunting Seminoles, red sticks. Seminoles, and so the so-called Red Sticks. It was a chief called Red Stick and his followers, and then the escape slave escapees, escaped slaves that would go down to Florida because in Spain slavery was outlawed now. So Andrew Jackson went to Florida, pretty much conquered Pensacola. It was a Spanish garrison. Disposed the governor, the Spanish governor, and he later commented. He later said that he should have killed him, but he just kind of sent them to Spain and put in place his own governor, Andrew Jackson. So, 1819 though, this became official. Right? Now we have Florida. Now Florida becomes our own territory of the U.S. The Transcontinental Treaty of 1819. It also clarified the border between the U.S. and Spain. Right, so this borderland over here, where we live right now. Now it's pretty where we're at, what the border is. So the U.S. gave up a lot of claims in California. Now that's Spanish Empire. Also, Russians kind of gave up a little bit of their Pacific Northwest claims. So, right, it's basically this Transcontinental Treaty of 1819. Basically, what it says is that this nation, the U.S., is going to be transcontinental. It's going to cross the continent. Right? This is an example of manifest destiny where we're going. Another example of this, besides the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819, is the Monroe Doctrine. James Monroe, where's his president? 1816. James Monroe gets elected as president. He's Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State, his position as Secretary of State, was seen as a stepping stone towards the president, right? So basically, all the way up to 1828, all the way up to when Andrew Jackson becomes president, the person who was Secretary of State became president. It was just like a stepping stone towards the presidency. So we have James Monroe as the president, and his Secretary of State is John Quincy Adams, the son of our second president, John Adams. So little Quincy, little Q, John Quincy Adams. I'm just kidding, never call him that. I call him that. John Quincy Adams. Right, he writes this. He writes part of the inaugural speech, right, the first speech that James Monroe gives to the nation. And part of this speech is called what we call now the Monroe Doctrine. And what the fuck is the Monroe Doctrine? So basically, it's what it says. It asserted a special relationship between the U.S. and the rest of Latin America, the rest of the American continent. Basically, what it says is that the Monroe Doctrine is that, I guess I'll read it from the book, just to be more specific. First, the United States would oppose any further efforts at colonization by European powers in the Americas. Right? So this was aimed not just at Spain, right? So you're not going to colonize the Americas, nowhere. Right? You're not going to try to get Mexico back, right? or Cuba back, none of these other colonies you have. Right? You're going to get away from the Americas. This is the Monroe Doctrine. So this was aimed not just at Spain, but also at France. France was also trying to get Mexico. And France also had a bunch of Caribbean colonies, right, plantations, but also at Russia, right? Russia was still in the game here, right? In the Pacific, in Oregon, basically, Alaska, all in that area there. Secondly, the U.S. would abstain, right? So in return, Europeans, your European empires, you guys stay away from the Americas. We, the U.S., will stay away from Europe. That's the deal. Monroe Doctrine, right? And then finally, there's all these rebellions happening in this time period. The last stipulation of the Monroe Doctrine was that you don't mess with these freedom movements. You don't mess with these Latin American countries trying to gain their independence. Again, European powers, stay away. Right? The U.S. now is the one who is the hegemon. Basically establishes U.S. hegemony in Latin America, or not Latin America, but the entire American continent. Hegemony is a really good word. I strongly recommend it. You look it up in your dictionary. All right. So that's like the most important, I guess, event that happened in James Monroe's presidency. So now we have 1824, the next election coming up. He gets reelected. In 1824 now, we have a different leader. In 1824, it's a really interesting election. It's usually called the corrupt bargain of 1824. So I said that John Quincy Adams was Secretary of State. Right? He was next up to become president, traditionally. But now we have the rise of democracy. And we have 4 people running for president in this time period here. There are Republicans. Right? It's an era of good feelings. Right? It's just one party. But we have different sections of this party. Right? Sectionalism, factionalism. Right? We have John Quincy Adams, of course, running for president. And then we have this guy Andrew Jackson. Right? Well, let me say it this way instead. Let me put it this way. So the original one that was the first choice was, of course, John Quincy Adams. And then the Republican Party was used to having the caucus, right? This big meeting where they would choose the presidency. And this caucus, though, was seen as this like elite little club of this elite aristocratic members of the Republican Party. And this is the rise of democracy, so we're trying to get rid of this facade of elitism. So I think only about like 80 or 30 something people went to this caucus, and they chose this guy Crawford. What's his first name? William Crawford. He was the Secretary of Treasury. He was from Georgia. So we had John Quincy Adams. We have this guy William Crawford. Then we have Secretary of War John Calhoun from South Carolina. You heard of John Calhoun before. We had the guy from the West, Henry Clay. Right, he was Speaker of the House. He's from Kentucky. And then we have this outsider, this outlier, right, Andrew Jackson. So we have all these fucking people there. Right, so I have John Quincy Adams, Calhoun, Henry Clay, Crawford, and then Andrew Jackson, the outside. Crawford gets a stroke. He's out. So now it's just 4 people. It comes down to 4, right? So we have Calhoun, Henry Clay, Republican, all Republicans. Anyways, long story short, basically what's happening, Jackson gets 99 electoral votes, and Quincy Adams gets 84 electoral votes. Crawford gets 41 electoral votes. So basically, none of them gets a majority. Right. So by the U.S. Constitution, since nobody gets the majority, it's up to the House of Representatives to choose the next president. So Clay is out. Because Clay is House of the Speaker. So Clay is out. So it's between John Adams, basically it's between John Adams and Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was the one who got the most, but still didn't get a majority. So it's up to the House of Representatives. So what's going on here, it goes to the House of Representatives. What's going on is that Henry Clay is the House Speaker. He has a lot of influence in the House of Representatives. He makes a deal with John Adams, with John Quincy Adams. And the deal is this, right? So remember, the Secretary of State is the next step towards the presidency. So Henry Clay says, you know what? I'll back you up, John Quincy Adams. if you give me the Secretary of State position in your cabinet. That's the deal. So Henry Clay kind of switches sides from Andrew Jackson and then supports John Quincy Adams uh, in return for him to get the Secretary of State position. And this is the corrupt bargain. So Andrew Jackson is totally furious. All his followers are completely furious about this. Right? This is seen as it's seen as corruption. Right? It's a corrupt bargain. It ain't really corrupt. Right? It wasn't really corruption. It was just this backdoor politics that happens all the fucking time. So John Quincy Adams becomes president. Henry Clay becomes Secretary of State, and from day one that Quincy Adams becomes president, Andrew Jackson begins campaigning against him for the next election. John Quincy Adams is a big proponent of the market system that I talked about earlier, the preservation of the national bank, the levying of the national tariff, and the improvement of national infrastructure by federal financing. His opponents, right, like Andrew Jackson, the Jacksonian Democrats now, right, because they're part of they're part of the people now. He's a common man, and look at this, right? This is corrupt bargain. It's an example of these politicians, right, and their corruption, and their exclusivity, and their intention of leaving out the common man. Right, so now Republicans create these the Democratic Republicans, right? They just call themselves the Democrats, basically, and they're under the leadership of Andrew Jackson. And below Andrew Jackson is Martin Van Buren. Van Buren is like the campaign manager, the campaign director for Andrew Jackson. So before this, before 1824, 1828, there was no like campaigning for presidency. Right? There was no like you go and do big rallies and go across the nation and try to gain support. There was none of that. It was not a spectacle, basically. It was about politics. And now with Andrew Jackson, he's about like selling his vision. He's selling his image to the people. We'll get to that right now. But first, so John Quincy Adams, he's a big supporter of liberalism, basically, right? This nationalist Republican, the American system, preservation of the national bank, this levying of protected tariffs for northern manufacturing goods, and the improvement of infrastructure. And his opponents, they railed against him that there was clear evidence that John Quincy Adams' intention was to benefit the wealthy at the expense of the common people. And that this branch, this section of the Republican Party, who call themselves the Nationalist Republicans, were more federalist than Jeffersonian, who Thomas Jefferson was the OG, right? Was like the symbol for the Republican Party, right? So they were calling, they were basically calling John Quincy Adams a traitor. His opponents. So this tariff was about 35%, right, of importing cotton, wool, hemp, and iron. That was passed, right? This was in 1824, a new tariff, right? So the tariff was passed, a new tariff was passed. Of course, it was completely opposed by the South because now it's more expensive to import or export these products, and the South depends on these products, right, for the things. In the North, they make these products, so they're the ones that are benefiting from this tariff, where the South is being hurt by these tariffs. So it really created this big difference between the Adams and the Jacksonian sections of the Republican Party, this tariff of 1824. So again, right, it just gave, so the corrupt bargain to begin with, and then this new tariff of 1824 just gave ammunition to the Jackson campaign against Adams in the election of 1828. All right. So let's talk about the election of 1828. So we have Martin Van Buren, this Democrat, I think he's from New York, And he's backing Andrew Jackson because he's also all about the common man and spreading democracy. He needs basically the mastermind of the campaign, the whole platform for the Republican. Basically, just sell the image of Andrew Jackson of this awesome hero. Remember, Andrew Jackson was the one that led not just in Florida, right, the conquest of Florida, even before Congress approved it, but he also won the Battle of New Orleans, where we kicked out the British from their very important and profitable commercial port of New Orleans. And that was not a battle, that was a massacre. Andrew Jackson lost only 27 people. The fucking British lost 2,000 men in that battle. I call it a massacre. The massacre of New Orleans. Uh, Andrew Jackson was a badass. I mean, he was a super macho man. Uh, for example, Andrew Jackson, for example, not only massacred, he was a great general. If he was suspicious of you deserting, he would shoot you on the spot. So he would exude ultimate loyalty from his soldiers. That was one of the things that like the Adams presidency would like rail against him during the campaign of 1828. That he killed a lot of his men because they were not loyal, and he was like, yeah, I did. Fuck him, right? I need loyalty. I'm a general. It was Old Hickory. That was his nickname. And Hickory is the strongest wood in the Americas, right? So very strong, macho man, right? Not only is he a great general, right? Very brutal general. Uh, he was just like, for example, during the campaign of 1828, one of the weapons against him, one of the things that the Adams presidency used against Andrew Jackson, uh, was that he was an adulterer. That he was so his wife, I forgot his wife's name, Mary something, got married to Andrew Jackson before she was totally divorced, legally divorced. So that was seen as like adultery, right? You're technically legally still bound to your other husband, and now you got married to Andrew Jackson, to this new guy, and that created tremendous heartache and just turmoil in the Jackson household. That in 1828, Andrew Jackson's wife died, and Andrew Jackson thought sincerely, he believed it to his end, to the end of his days, that it was the result of this pressure from the campaign. The people were calling her out for being this adulteress. This guy Charles Dickinson one day personally called out Andrew Jackson, like, dude, fuck you, you're just an adulterer. Like your wife, look at your wife, you should look at her. She's not how can you be, how can you be a man and stuff. And Charles Dickinson was known as this really, really good crack shot shooter, right? Really good shooter. Still, Andrew Jackson being this macho man, right? My honor is being hurt here, and he was hurt. He was, the wife has already died now. He was fucking pissed. Anybody who would talk shit about his wife, he would kill, basically. Andrew Jackson would. So Charles Dickinson, right? He calls Andrew Jackson out, and they go on a duel, right? And this guy is really good shot. This Dickinson guy, right? He's a really, really good shot. He's better than Andrew Jackson with a gun. But Andrew Jackson, being a macho man, he's like, fuck this, I'm not gonna back down. So what he does, Andrew Jackson, is that he wears a big coat, an oversized coat, oversized coat, so where you can't see where the body begins and ends, right? And Andrew Jackson insists, that the other guy, the really good shooter, Charles Dickinson, shoots first. And he does. Boom, he shoots first. He shoots Andrew Jackson. He shoots him, and he shoots him right in the rib, right next to the heart. Misses a really important organ. And Jackson doesn't fucking flinch. He's just like, nothing. And Charles Dickinson is like, what the fuck, did I miss? Like, I know I didn't miss. There's no way I missed. And he didn't. He hit him right in the lung, basically. And Andrew Jackson is just like, didn't move at all. Right? He's just, imagine that. Imagine like, getting shot like in his chest and not moving. Right? And the reason why he did this, right? And so now Andrew Jackson hits, it's his turn to shoot, and Andrew Jackson doesn't miss. Andrew Jackson hits him right in the stomach and the gut, and this guy bleeds out. Right? And this guy dies thinking that he missed Andrew Jackson. And this was on purpose. Andrew Jackson wanted to show off that he's just a bigger man than him, right? And for the rest of his life, Andrew Jackson had like a bad ailment of this. He couldn't breathe right for the rest of his life because of this shooting that he got. But that's just one example of like how intense Andrew Jackson was, right? He got shot in the chest and didn't flinch, and then shot this guy to death. Andrew Jackson, and then he becomes our president, 1828. One of his campaign models is pretty funny. Is vote for Andrew Jackson, who can fight, not Quincy Adams, who can write. So don't vote for this nerd guy, this nerdy Quincy Adams, who's a really intellectual who could write. Vote for Andrew Jackson, who could fight. You know, he's a common man, right? And people bought that image, right? They're like, fuck yeah, let's vote for Andrew Jackson. And he won in a landslide, 1828, Andrew Jackson, right? He got 68% of the electoral vote, and he got 56% of the popular vote. So a whopping majority of both of them, basically. Okay. Adams only got Massachusetts, only the North, and Andrew Jackson got the rest. Shit, Andrew Jackson even got Maine too. So yeah, it's complete landslide. So Jackson's election, basically, it showed, it demonstrated how this universal white suffrage, right? White males could vote now. Doesn't matter if you own land or not, or have money or not. And this organization under Martin Van Buren of political parties had completely transformed American politics. So now we're in the age of Jackson proper. It took us about 45 minutes to get here, huh? God damn. The age of fucking Jackson. So Andrew Jackson is a crazy motherfucker. Right? And his presidency is pretty interesting. Right? So even though he's a nationalist, not really a nationalist. He's not a nationalist. He's all about the states. Right? He's a Democrat. He's a Democratic Republican. He's all about all the government, all the power, the sovereignty should be laid on the people, on the states. Right? He's a champion of the self-proclaimed common man. Right? He went from rags to riches. Right? He first became wealthy, and he lost that wealth, and then he hit rock bottom again. He became wealthy again. So he's like all about that, the self-made man. Right? But his vision of this democracy of the self-made man only applied to white European men. Indians were excluded, African Americans were excluded, and women were excluded as well. The focal point of government activity should be the states and not the federal government. So now we have a rise also with Andrew Jackson in power. We have the rise of party machines. Political parties become really important. Right? It's a spectacle now. Politics become a spectacle. It's about the image of whoever you're going to vote for. Right? It's not about. In 1824, nobody knew what the fuck Andrew Jackson was supporting politically, what his political platform was. Nobody knew what he was for. All we knew is he was a badass war hero, and we should vote for him because he could fight. And John Quincy Adams could only write. Yeah, it was about the image, right? To politics now, it's a spectacle. He also, under the age of Jackson, we see this rise of the spoils system. Basically, Andrew Jackson handpicks people to certain governmental positions. So loyalty becomes key to rising up in your party's rank, because the president is the one that's going to choose what job you have in the party. Right? It's called the spoils system. So, for example, like the postmaster and custom officials, they were handpicked by Andrew Jackson. So you gotta be loyal to Andrew Jackson to get those really good positions, government positions, and then go make your way up the ladder inside the political machine of this party system. Also, but yeah, there's a rise of sectionalism, right? Different sections of the Republicans, and there's a whole new rise of a new political party, finally, right? So the era of good feelings ends, right? And there's not just one party controlling politics, the Republican Party. Now, as a response to Andrew Jackson, to this Jacksonian democracy, we have the rise of this new party called the Whigs. The Whig Party. The Whigs. Whigs. And they get this name from European. Back in the day, the Whig Party were the opponents of royal power, of royalty, of the monarch in Europe, in England, back in the 18th century, the 1700s. This was the Whigs Party. This was the Republicans back then in England that were against the monarchy. King Jackson was the nickname that the Whigs gave to Andrew Jackson because of all these parole system and all this. Andrew Jackson strengthened the power of the executive office of the president. Right? He did a lot of things. For example, he vetoed shit, and veto was seen like this emergency power, and he used it a lot. He did a lot of things without congressional approval, right? And all in the name because the people voted for him. Right? It was the people who voted him in. It was the first time that all the people, well, all the white people, all the white men, doesn't matter if you own land or not, were able to vote in U.S. history. So he would use that as a justification. That it was no, I am the representation of the will of the people. So the Whigs were the nationalists, right? So now we have two parties. So we have basically the Democrats. Oh my God, this is not working no more. Motherfucker. We have the Whigs and we have the Democrats. Democrats is the Andrew Jackson's camp. They were alarmed. The Democrats. This is like their characteristics. They were much alarmed by this widening gap between social classes, between the very wealthy and the common man. They want to cut that gap. They riled against these so-called non-producers, the bankers, the merchants, the speculators that would just make money out of finance, that would not produce anything out of their hands. Right? They would sit in offices and make money that way. Right? These non-producers, right? To complete opposite view of the Jeffersonian yeoman, right? This independent farmer that should be the epitome of the American citizen. Right? This is what the Democrats wanted, right? And the Whigs, right, were like the non-producers, right? The bankers and the speculators and stuff. The Democrats, right? The Jacksonian Democrats, they wanted the government to enhance the wealth or the standing of the producing classes, of the farmers, of the artisans, of the laborers. This should be the ones we should give money to, right? We should be protecting these people. And besides that, they had like a very strong libertarian approach, a complete hands-off, laissez-faire. Right? The government should not interfere, right, towards the economy. It should not give or award any special favoritism to certain sectors, right? For example, the tariff of 1816, of 1826, was seen as like being favored towards the North, as benefiting the North and not the South. Right? So the Democrats were against this. Demos for the people. And now we have the Whigs. And they were like, no, the Whigs were like, no, these Jackson is centralizing power in the executive. Right? So the Whigs United were behind the American system. The Whigs believe that via this protective tariff and this national bank and internal improvements to infrastructures, right, canals and roads, that this could be the guide towards economic development for all. That this active national government in the economy is going to guide this development, this progress, economic progress. And it's a good thing, right? The complete opposite view as the Democrats. Obviously, businessmen and bankers were the backers of the Whigs. Right? So we have now these two parties, this emergence of two parties, the Whig Party and the Democrats. Right, the Democrats were all about, liberty is best secured by local and state governments. Let's not give power to this national government. So it was a danger to liberty, this far away federal government, and over there in Philadelphia and Virginia, right, in D.C., saying what everybody should do in the Union, in the whole United States. That's wrong. That's a danger to liberty. These are the Democrats, the Jacksonian Democrats, right? People that backed up Andrew Jackson. For example, Andrew Jackson vetoed a national road, a Waynesville Road or something like that. The national voting vetoed it, even though Congress, both houses passed it by great majorities. He was like, no, we should keep away, like maintaining that old Jeffersonian vision that the national government should not be too much involved in the economy. Free agency was key for the Democrats, whereas for the Whigs, an activist national government was key. So between the individual or big national government, right? All right. I've already talked about the tariff abominations. So in South Carolina, there's another tariff in 1828 that's passed. Surprisingly, Andrew Jackson passes this tariff, right? Almost in complete contradiction to his own ideals. But because Andrew Jackson also wants to unify the nation, right? He's also preoccupied to maintain unity between the nation, right? So he passes this kind of as a compromise. So the tariff of 1828, it raised taxes on imported manufactured goods. Again, right? Wool, cotton, iron. Right? Like the South completely opposed this tariff of 1828. They call it the so-called tariff of abomination. Look at this other book here that talks about this. And this tariff led directly to talks about nullification, right? This theory of nullification in South Carolina, specifically South Carolina. So who is the main guy for South Carolina? John C. Calhoun. So John C. Calhoun in 1828, he writes this the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. And what this is a justification for the theory of nullification. And this theory stipulates that under this theory, states, right, individual states, might declare a particular federal law as null and void within their borders. So actually, Calhoun published this anonymously, right, under a pen name, but he made it obviously known that it was him. Anyways, in the exposition, right, the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, Calhoun argued that the federal government was the creation of the states. In agreeing to create a federal government, the states had ceded some powers, but only conditionally, only for a little while, only on the condition, and that the states always reserve the right to do what's necessary to ensure their survival as, quote unquote, distinct political communities. So in other words, a state had, under this theory of nullification, a state had the right to assert its sovereignty in defiance of federal policies that might threaten the distinctive character of that state. Each state retained the right to prevent enforcement within its borders of acts of Congress that exceeded the powers specifically spelled out in the Constitution. So Calhoun was this, like, he was known as a very strict logician, right, using logic. Besides being this extreme racist person, right, he hated African Americans and he hated Native Americans. Besides being that, he was extremely logical, right? For example, there's a story about him that he wrote a love poem to his wife, where that every line started off with whereas, the trees and the sky is blue, whereas this, whereas, and in the end it was therefore I love you, right? So this is like a logic, right? This is exactly how in logic you set up your arguments, right? You have premises, whereas this chai tea is sweet, therefore I like to drink it, right? It's logical. There's a sequence of events here, right? And he wrote a love poem in this logical format to his wife, right? And he used logic to defend his nullification theory, right? So, for example, the states had existed before the federal constitution. Representation at the Constitutional Convention, right, in Philadelphia, when we wrote the Constitution, was ratified by the states. Representation in the federal government was determined by states. So he basically had history, right, backing him up, right, as his premises, as his justification for his theory. However, though, the Constitution still stipulated, right, it explicitly said that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, that it overrides state constitutions. So you had that, and that it was ratified not by states but by the people. All right. And also, moreover, right, things like this, right, just this nullification, right, going against the federal government was increasingly seen as treasonous, as treason, right, as being a traitor, especially after the Hartford Convention that killed the Federalist Party, right. The states' rights arguments had this, like, a whiff of treason, right. So not too many people went along, right. The only state that was South Carolina that was along this theory, right. So they were by themselves, South Carolina. Nonetheless, right, it created a crisis, created a debate in Congress. We have this guy Daniel Webster, right, this guy from Massachusetts, right? This nationalist from Massachusetts, and he gives like this very fiery and passionate speech against Calhoun. Right? It's called this is known as the Webster-Wayne debate. And Robert Hayne is basically just a disciple of Calhoun. He's a spokesperson for Calhoun. And what Daniel Webster says is pretty powerful. He says that the revolution, right? He goes back to the revolution, right? The basis, the foundation of the U.S. country, of our country, was fought by the American people, right? And the American people had created the federal government. Right, this once glorious unit, right? The union as it is, every true American heart must recommit itself to the founding spirit of the nation, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. And he was thundering, he was yelling this in the Congress, in the floor of Congress, right? Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. Right? Don't be a traitor. We've got to maintain this unity, that we'd fought for, right? All of us, the American people, fought for in the Revolution. Why, Cahoon, in South Carolina, are you trying to break away? Because in this exposition that Cahoon wrote, he says that if all else fails, the state has a right to secede, to leave the Union. So you have this debate, right? I mean, it's just foreshadowing the Civil War here. Right? So that's called the nullification crisis. Jackson is stuck in the middle. It's like, what the fuck do I do? I gotta calm South Carolina down, but I also want to maintain, right, this ideal of state rights. Right? So he's stuck in the middle. So Jackson kind of does a compromise. He enacts a new tariff in 1832 at the behest of Northerners and at the detriment of the southern states like South Carolina and Georgia, these southern states. So he enacts a new 1832 tariff. He does reduce the rates though on the taxes on South Carolina on the imported goods, but he also passes the so-called Force Act that authorizes the executive branch, the president, Andrew Jackson, namely, to use the army, to send the army or the navy to collect custom duties, to collect taxes. Right? So like Rhode Island before him, and then the Door War, and then now in South Carolina, we're threatening with not giving up the taxes they have collected and giving it to the federal government. Now with the Force Act, the president is authorized to use the army and the navy to go collect this. Right? This is seen like a federalist move. This is exactly what Hamilton and his cronies would do. This is what the Federalists would do, right? This strengthened the national power of the federal government. Right? This is in complete opposition of what Jefferson would do, right? A complete opposition of what even Jackson intentionally would do, right? But now we have these crises that is making him compromise. Right? There's a lot of ironies in the Jacksonian presidency, where he was all about state rights and individual liberty, but he has to compromise. And a lot of the acts and a lot of the laws that he enacts end up strengthening the federal government. Another important thing that he does while in office at Jackson, right? So he fucking hates Indians. Does with a passion, basically. The Indian Removal Act, right? So this is a really bad part of U.S. history here. So Jackson and Native peoples, right? So Jackson looked at the West, and he think that the West was for the common man, namely the white common man, right? So by 1828, right, most Indian resistance, of Native resistance of the Great Lakes were pushed out of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. There's only a few Native American tribes that were sticking around the Great Lakes, such as the Ojibwa, the Winnebago, the Sauk, the Meskwaki, the Kickapoo, the Menominee. All these tribes kind of still retain the sizable traditional ancestral lands in the Great Lakes area. In the South, you also had the so-called 5 civilized tribes: the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Creeks, and the Cherokees, and the Seminoles. These tribes, these 5 tribes that we just mentioned, had adopted American ways of living. Right? They became agricultural. They had their own constitution, written language, and a written constitution. They had their own lawyers. Right? They totally bought the idea of assimilation, but in their own languages, in their own nation. So each one of these tribes had their own nation, but they adopted American ways of life. Right? They were not nomadic no more. They were agrarian. Right? They were yeomen. But nonetheless, they had control of these old ancestral lands, all the way from Georgia, North Georgia, all the way up to like Carolina. Tennessee, and all these areas. So Georgia, Tennessee, Carolinas, Kentucky, Virginia, all that area there was pretty much like this ancestral land of these 5 civilized tribes, all the way down to Florida, the Seminoles. But Jackson's views on concerning the Native Americans was fuck them, basically. Punish the barbarians, what he said in his inaugural speech. We need to punish the barbarian. How can I? Yeah, this one does a really bad job. I'll just do it from this one here. So most Americans, we're not threatened by Indians directly, right? If we were going west, right, especially like from the Mississippi eastwards, right, this is still called the West, right, the Old West, the Old Northwest and stuff. If you were going that way, right, settling across the Appalachian Mountains, by 1828, American Indians were not a threat. You would see them in passing, right? They would not directly be a threat to you by 1828. The harm, though, that the Indians did represent in 1828 was that they still controlled land that we needed. So it wasn't that they were resisting against us, it's just that they still had treaties that justified their claims to these lands. And Andrew Jackson saw the West as should be open to our white settlers, not to these Native Americans. They're not producers. They don't know how to produce those land. And they're inferior. It's just genetically inferior to us. They're barbarians. We need to get rid of these people. And also, this also underscores his attempts or his commitment, right? Andrew Jackson's commitment to the sovereignty of the nation, to reassert, right, this democratic nationalism. Right, in straight up also, right, he's all about extending slavery. Right, people like Missouri were about we should convert Indian soil to slave soil. And so there's all these other pressures, not just Andrew Jackson, but other politicians that are pushing for the displacement of Native Americans from these lands. The perfect example of this is in Georgia. And this is where the Cherokees and the Creeks lived in Georgia. Well, officials there in Georgia complained that the federal government had not kept its promise to remove all the Indians from the state. And this was part of this agreement in 1802 that the state of Georgia had agreed with the federal government that they would cede some lands, some Georgia lands for the state of Georgia. In response, the federal government will kick out the Indians from Georgia. In 1826, though, the federal government did kind of keep up this promise. They did pressure the Creeks to move out. And then the governor of Georgia sent some surveyors, some land surveyors into that area. However, some Creeks still remained there. Not all Creeks accepted to move out. And John Quincy Adams threatened the governor of Georgia that he was going to send troops to maintain the sovereignty of these Indians. And Georgia saw this as an affront. They're like, wow, you're going to take the Indian side over our side? That's fucked up. So there was tension brewing there already, even before Andrew Jackson was president. But by 1830, 2 years after he becomes president, the Cherokee Nation takes the state of Georgia to the Supreme Court, sues the state of Georgia. And this is the Supreme Court decision of the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. All right, so the Cherokee Nation was, they claim, they were arguing that the Cherokee Nation was a foreign nation in the sense of our constitutional law. And as a foreign nation, the state of Georgia had no right to pass laws over this foreign nation, right, the Cherokee Nation. And Chief Justice John Marshall, he agreed with the Cherokee Nation. He agreed that the Cherokees were a distinct political society, and that no foreign state should, interfere with the treaties that the U.S. had made with these nations. And then the next year, there's another court decision, Worcester versus Georgia, um, and Marshall kind of like clarified more what this meant. So in 1832, with Worcester versus Georgia, uh, it did maintain that they were a political separate entity, and a political separate identity, but is the federal government now, not states, who must deal with these Indians. So before Worcester versus Georgia, each state individually dealt with the Indian problem. That's what they called it back then, the Indian problem. They were saying that's a problem. Now with Worcester versus Georgia, John Marshall, right? He's a federalist, right? Asserted that the federal government now has the power over states on how to deal with Indians. Okay. Andrew Jackson was like, okay, cool, Supreme Court. That was your decision. Then you enforce it. I'm not gonna enforce that. I don't give a fuck about that. That's exactly what he said. That's exactly what Andrew Jackson said. Quote unquote, this is what he said. John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. When technically, under the US Constitution, the president, the executive, needs to enforce the law of the land. And he was like, nah, let him enforce it. Fuck him, basically. So Jackson refused to enforce this decision by the Supreme Court because he long believed that the best policy is to remove Indians from these lands and entirely open up these lands to white settlers. Van Buren also responded. Martin Van Buren, he's part of the Jacksonian Democrats, right? Uh, he created this board of immigration, preservation, and improvement of Aboriginal Indians, basically saying that this removal of Indians from their ancestral land was an opportunity, was an act of philanthropy, was an act of benefit, was an act of charity by the U.S. government. And Andrew Jackson also had this justification, this logic. Um, for example, Andrew Jackson said that, for example, let me see, let me read it here verbatim of what he says. It's pretty funny, I think. Um, where is it? I think I lost it. God damn it! I should have. This one. Well, basically, what he says. I guess it's not verbatim. I'm just gonna paraphrase here. But what Andrew Jackson said is like, look, the history of the U.S. right, us white settlers, is all about moving westward. It's all about moving from our ancestral lands. It's about moving from England, which is our ancestral lands, and going to another place for opportunity, for freedom. This is what Americans are and do. And likewise, Native Americans, moving from your ancestral lands is an opportunity, just like us. This is what the American spirit is all about. Moving from your ancestral lands. This is then an opportunity for y'all. This is gonna benefit you all if you move from these ancestral lands in Georgia and the Ohio Lakes and the Great Lakes over there. All right, so they were kind of twisting this around as this forced expulsion, this forced removal of these Indians as a good thing for them, right? And this was part of that the board for the immigration, preservation, and improvement of the Aborigines of America. So they argued basically that Indians were ill-equipped for contact with civilization, with white civilization, and that removing them was humane, was the right thing to do, because Indians don't know how to deal with white Americans. John Quincy Adams, our former president, was part of this board, was one of the supporters of this Removal Act. It only took 4 months of debate, and it was passed by Congress. Not much of a debate there, right? So in 1830, Congress passed and President Jackson signed an act to provide for an exchange of lands with the Indians residing in any of the states or territories and for the removal west of the river of Mississippi. So all Indians living right east of the Mississippi have to move west, namely in Oklahoma, eastern Oklahoma, which is called Indian country, Indian territory now. So Jackson praised this removal act as an act of philanthropy. Right? Oh, here it is. This is what Jackson says. I found it. Doubtless it will be painful to leave the graves of their fathers. But what do they do more than our ancestors did, than our children are now doing? In fact, leaving the land of their birth was, for these Indians, a natural opportunity, just like it was for our ancestors, for us, and for our children right now. People were going west, right? Moving. Right? Of course, it wasn't. No? It was not an opportunity. And it totally devastated the very identity of what these Native Americans were. This created to the Trail of Tears, right? This Native American Removal Act. So in 1830, the Choctaws were forced from their lands in the Mississippi area. The Chickasaws and the Creeks in 1832 followed suit. Then, 6 years after this act of the Removal Act was passed by Congress, in 1836, the Cherokees were forced to move. And these people had gone to court. They gone to the Supreme Court to fight this. Right? Remember, these people had lawyers. They were civilized tribes. They had lawyers. They had constitutions. They had written laws and stuff. So it was like a 4-year battle. Right? The Cherokees, basically the Cherokees, were the most, I guess, civilized ones. It took them 4 years and to not fight. They were fighting in court for 4 years, and finally in 1836, they were forced to move towards Oklahoma. One of the treaties that these lawyers passed, the Cherokees, under the leadership of this guy Ross. What's his fucking name? John Ross, I believe. Half Cherokee, half white. The Treaty of the New Echota. So that within 2 years of this treaty in 1836, the Cherokees would leave the mountains for Indian Territory in Oklahoma, in return for safe passage, $5 million, $5 million, food, shelter, equipment, and medicine for a year after they arrived there. That was the treaty for the Cherokees. This passed in the spring of 1836. However, not all the Cherokees agreed to this. So there was 2 camps. Right? So there was the pro-treaty Cherokees and the anti-treaty Cherokees. The overwhelming majority of Cherokees thought that this treaty was a fraud. They didn't agree to this treaty. Nonetheless, Congress signed it and took it. So only a small number of Cherokees agreed to this treaty. And Congress said, like, oh, it applies to the whole nation, when it was never agreed to by the nation itself, the Cherokee Nation itself. So 3 years later, after the unsuccessful appeals to the Supreme Court, the Cherokees were finally removed from their eastern lands in Georgia and in those mountains there, and forced to march in what became known as the Trail of Tears, or what they called the Trail in which we cried. So they were driven off their homelands towards Oklahoma. What happened is that most of these people delayed the removal. I mean, they were going to fight to the very end to stay there where their ancestors lived forever. And they made free preparations to leave. Most of them were not prepared to leave. So many died of disease, malnutrition, dehydration, exhaustion, frostbite. It was just terrible marching all the way from Georgia all the way to fucking Oklahoma on foot. It's fucked up. In 1831, though, there was resistance to this. It was not taken lightly. So we have the Sox. We have this guy Black Hawk. This doesn't work. So this is over there by Illinois, southern Illinois, the Sauk Indians, led by Black Hawk, the leader Black Hawk. He raised about a band of 500 warriors, and he attacked state militiamen. The whole summer of 1831 spent just fighting against white people, basically. Black Hawk. Pretty. It was. I mean, for the whole summer, it was pretty intense fighting. You know, they did kill a lot of white people there. But finally, by August of 1832, the last the last warriors of this Black Hawk brigade of these warriors were massacred by the army. But it was an important event of Indian resistance to this removal act. Also, the Florida Seminoles, the Red Sticks, the so-called Red Sticks, because their leader was called Red Stick, they were more successful than Black Hawk and their warriors. So these people, the Seminoles, and these Red Sticks, they included Creeks, these really militant Creeks, right? These warrior Creeks, and then a bunch of runaway slaves. This war, right? There's the first Seminole War, the second Seminole War. It would drag on for 7 years. Besides, finally, in 1842, President Tyler could say that we're victorious over the Seminoles, but not really though. The Seminoles were technically the only Native American tribes, the only Native American tribe that were never conquered by the U.S. The Seminoles. So there was pockets of deep resistance against this removal act. This totally changed the landscape over here in Oklahoma, in the western frontier now. Right, so over here we had the Comanche Empire that controlled all this area. For the Europeans in the map, it was Spain that controlled this area, which was like Oklahoma, Texas, right, going down to Coahuila, Sonora, Arizona, New Mexico, southern Colorado, Utah, up into California, the Southwest, all that Southwest, it was basically controlled by the Comanches. Powerful fucking tribe. It was an empire. Let me bring you up real quick. It's gonna be upside down. Well, you ever like Indian history? The Comanche Empire by Pekka Hemalainen. He's a Comanche. And yeah, these people controlled. Spain was the technical empire that claimed land there, but Spain had to give gifts to the Comanche Empire for the Comanches not to attack Spain, right? The Spanish frontier there in Texas and in New Mexico. So the Comanches had to agree to make room for these newcomers, for these Creeks, and for these Cherokees, and for these Choctaws that were forced to march all the way to Oklahoma, to Comanche, to the Comancheria, right, to the Comanche land. So they agreed to make room for these removed Indians, who they found out that they were able to trade with these Indians. So these Cherokees, these Choctaws, and these Creeks, right, the Seminoles, they had already established trading routes with eastern ports, right? So soon, these displaced tribes were trading crops and government-issued guns and ammunition to the Comanches. So the Comanches now found a new person, a new trade partner to get guns from. Now we're not dependent. The Comanches are not dependent on Spanish and their weapon and their horses. Now we get that stuff from the Americans. And I'm talking as a Comanche here. I wish I was Comanche. I'm not. So, and then the Comanches, in return, right, the main commodities that the Comanches would trade for guns were slaves and horses. Right? The Comanches had a monopoly on the slave trade and the interior slave trade on this side. Right. So another, I think I have it here. Right. Another book. It's important. It's called The Other Slavery. I'm just gonna send this. Let's get this upside down. But it's called The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in the Americas. So Indians were very much as part of slavery here in the Americas. The Comanches during this time period were. We had white slaves here that the Comanches would sell to people. Right? So ironically, so I'll just read this here. When they were forced to migrate, these southeastern Indians, right, the five civilized tribes, they had brought with them 5,000 black slaves. In the workforce uh, with them, the Comanches also sold them slaves to replenish this workforce that they needed to reestablish their agricultural ways of life in Oklahoma. The Indians were displaced because supposedly, this is what Jackson would say, and these people, the justification for the Removal Act. Ironically, the Indians were displaced because they could not adapt to the American way of life, right? Its values and practices, right, such as representative government, Christianity, racial slavery, and agricultural um, commerce. All those things that made the American way of life what it is were soon adopted by these displaced Indians in Oklahoma, right? So representative government, Christianity, and racial slavery soon became the way of life for these poor Indians in Oklahoma. And this was the same thing that was the reason why we moved them in the first place, because they couldn't do that, right? So terrible irony of history. So basically, these people, these new Indians that landed in Oklahoma, that were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands, they became um, the middleman between the Comanches and the Americans in the East, the American Empire in the East, which soon will gobble up the Comanche Empire. So as American weapons made their way towards the West in the hands of this Comanche Empire, the Spanish became super alarmed. They're like, fuck. The Spanish now found that all these gifts that would give, worth thousands of dollars of gifts that they would give to the Comanches to maintain peace, was not enough for the Comanches anymore, because they could find that stuff for cheaper with the Americans, right? So the Spanish influence in the West started to wane as a result of the Comanches coming in contact via these forcibly removed Indians from the southeast with American capital. Interesting stuff here. So the Indian Removal Act was not just terrible for the Indians themselves, it also created this whole ripple effect, right, that would last into the 1900s. All right, let's talk about the last thing here. We'll be talking about a lot of things now. There's the Bank War. Everything that Jackson did during his time as a president. The Bank War. So the second bank of the U.S., Jackson was totally opposed to it. He did his. Remember that he had the bank had a charter for 20 years, and Jackson tried to destroy it before that, during his presidency. So we have Jackson versus Nicholas Biddle. Nicholas Biddle is president of the bank, and he completely went against Jackson. He was just as pompous and as arrogant as Andrew Jackson. So it was this war of arrogancies. Andrew Jackson said that the bank wants to destroy me, but I will destroy it first. So it became really heated. It was a war. It's called the Bank War, basically. So what's going on here? The most important thing to think about here is that these exclusive charters that the bank was given further widened the gap between the wealthy and the humbled producers, according to Jackson. So the bank war reflected how Jackson enhanced the power of the presidency during his 8 years in the office. Right, he basically made the bank illegitimate in the eyes of the nation. Um, Basically, his appeal to the common man and against this bank that would give special privileges to bankers and to manufacturers and big businessmen pretty much assured his re-election in 1832. What the way that Jackson destroyed the bank was that he created so-called pet banks. So he dismembered the bank, right? He just cut it cut. He did withdraw all the federal deposits from the bank and set up little pet banks, little state banks that were loyal to Jackson. However, these fucking state banks, it was so easy for them to just print money again, right? And speculate with land, this time with land. And the same thing happened as it happened in 1819. A panic ensued. This is the panic of 1837. Uh, pretty much the same thing, right? You just print a lot of money, a lot of inflation, a lot of loans that are just bubble. They have no worth. So when you reclaim those loans, you can't pay them back, and it creates this whole big chain of events, right? So this depression lasted to 1843. This panic. It was terrible. Um, and there was an effect of this bank war, basically. As a response, Andrew Jackson passed the Specie Act, the Circular Specie Act, which directed that these land offices, right, these federal land offices that were selling the land for cheap, and then when they were trying to get the money back, they were receiving worthless pieces of paper money. So the Specie Circular Act, they directed these land offices not to accept no more paper money, but to accept only real money, hard money, silver or gold, which we call specie, right? Precious metals for payments for Western lands. So the effect was supposedly to shut out land speculators from this. This is the reason why the Panic of 1837 started, because of land speculators. But really, in reality, what happened in effect was that the specie circular shut out actual settlers who could not get enough gold or silver to pay for this. Right? They were already indebted with all this paper money that was useless, and they had no way to get gold or silver to pay for land now. So really, it really helped out the land speculators that already had the wealth to buy with land, with actual hard money. So you have this big debate between, should we go with soft money or hard money, hard currency or soft money? Should we go with paper money and as promissory notes that it is backed up by actual hard silver and gold, or should we just not use paper money and just use silver and gold for the economy? So that's something that's going to pop up later on as well. So after Jackson did his 2 terms, the presidency, we have Martin Van Buren, pretty much handpicked by Jackson to become the next president. And he was all about hard money, right? Specie. He was anti-bank, right? Anti-print money. And he totally got rid of the Bank of the U.S. And if it wasn't for the gold rush in 1848, that all of a sudden just poured all this hard money into the nation, we would have gone into a really, really deep depression. Because even though print money inflated prices and banks, if unregulated, would just keep on printing money without guaranteeing it being backed up by actual gold, these banks were necessary for farmers and for businesses, for loans, and for whatever, right? To finance business, to finance the economy. Right? So in essence, a national bank and state banks are necessary things for the type of economy that we run in. But Benjamin Buren was a hardcore Democrat that hated banks, and he got rid of the national bank. And we were about to go into deep depression because nobody had the money to produce anything. We had no loans available for nothing. And then, lo and behold, right, boom, we strike fucking gold in California. And all of a sudden, we have all this input of gold to help us maintain the economy. So now, let's go to 1840, the end of this chapter, the election of 1840. We have the Democrats and the Whigs spelling it out. Van Buren found out that without Jackson's support and his image, he's nothing. He's not voted. He's not reelected as president again. Now we have what is it? William Henry Harrison. And the reason why he got elected now is the spectacle. Politics is a spectacle. It's about the image of the person running for presidency. So the image that he was put on was as the log cabin candidate. That he was like the poor. He was a common man, right? The same strategy that Jackson used. Now the Whigs use that strategy, right? So he was a log cabin candidate, right? He was a champion of the common man now, right? This William Henry Harrison. In reality, he was not. He was a fucking wealthy man. I think he was from New York too. Anyways, he got elected. William Henry Harrison got elected. Now the Whigs are in party. Now the Democrats lose power in the presidency. But basically, the importance of the election of 1840 is that selling candidates for their image was just as important as the political position for which they stood. So the image of the candidate now became important as well. And this was clear in 1840. Lastly, just to end this long-ass lecture here, is that Harrison dies very quickly as he assumed office. I think within a month later, after he assumed office, he contracts pneumonia and Harrison dies. So now the vice president becomes president, who is John Tyler. And John Tyler is just inept. He's just a dumbass. First of all, he's more Republican than a Democrat. So he goes against his own party. He becomes an enemy of his own party, and he's pretty much like a rogue president. His own party hated him and called him his accidency. Right? It was an accident that he became president, or the executive ass. Right? The executive ass, John Tyler. Pretty much he never did anything. He didn't accomplish anything in 4 years because he couldn't. He was always enemies of his own party, that everything he tried to do, any law he proposed or any proposal, was rebutted right away by his own party. And his party controlled Congress, both houses. He could have done a lot, but he was just fucking weird. He was just a dumbass. Right? He was just very arrogant, basically. So Tyler's lack of success, basically, right? What the significance of John Tyler's presidency actually is this: that his lack of success showed that political party now had become central to American government. So without a party to support him, John Tyler, right, or any president after him, could not govern effectively. Now you need to be in tow with the party line. Right? You need political parties now become really important institutions for American governments. All right. That's the end of this chapter 10. That's the end of the age of Jackson. Right. Next time we'll talk about slavery. This whole next unit is all about slavery leading up to the Civil War. So chapter 11 is the so-called peculiar institution. Right. It's peculiar because we're a democracy, yet we have slavery as the basis for our economy. So the peculiar institution of slavery in a democracy, that's going to be the topic for chapter 11. So until next time, please be safe and stay home.